Well, anyways, thank you once again for this is our third installment in the listening to the LGBTQ community. And we have Dylan Shipman tonight from St. Elizabeth's. You are the music director at St. Elizabeth's, and he has just finished his seminary training at Garrett.
Yes.
And so I present Dylan Shipman.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Bob, thank you so much for inviting me here to come back. I am thrilled that y'all are on this journey. Oh, I have to say, in addition to me being all of those things, I'm also Ida's firstborn son. When my aunt came up to visit and she met her, she said, "Oh, hi, I'm Dylan's aunt," and she said, "Hi, I'm Ida's Ida said, "Hi, I'm his black mama." So she was just establishing it. She was putting it down. There are a lot of people here in your congregation that I love very dearly, including Ida and Larry and Renee, who was one of my professors in seminary. So you are very blessed as a congregation to have incredible people here. So in addition to being the director of music, I'm also the pastoral intern. I'm a postulant for the priesthood in this diocese, and moving along in my ordination process as well. So some of you might remember that I was here 2 years ago with you, 2 years ago in October. And we talked then primarily about Scripture, the Bible, some of the passages that are kind of referred to as the clobber passages that have really been used to harm LGBTQ people over the years in the church. So we're going to do a little bit of review on that tonight as well, but I really have a bit of an expansive presentation on a lot of topics and what goes into making an affirming faith community. So I want you to know that I want this to be a dialogue. So at any point, please feel free to ask a question. Feel free to make a comment. I want this to be a safe place as well, because this is really important work you're doing. So don't be afraid to ask a question. Don't be ashamed to voice a concern or potentially even an anxiety, because that's what this is about. And I'm happy to answer your question. If it's a sincere question, I'm happy to do my best to answer it or for us to have some dialogue about it. So let's get started. You are going to notice that throughout my presentation, I use LGBTQ+. Now, I think kind of by now, many of us are very familiar that LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. But perhaps you've seen a lot of other letters that have followed that somewhere before. One of my friends, Anna, who is a queer pastor, she calls it the queer alphabet soup of letters. And they can kind of tend to go on and on and on. I've kind of gotten into the habit in conversation with a lot of other people of multiple identities of using this, so we don't have kind of a list that kind of rolls off the page and goes on and on. But what I want to say is that I think that the plus is important because all of those other identities are very important. And our understanding about all of the identities continues to grow. And we continue to gain understanding as people, in many ways, feel more comfortable to share who they are authentically. And we continue to gain understanding, and through that gaining of understanding, we continue to shift our vocabulary. It's always in evolution. And sometimes things that we learned 10 years ago that we thought were cutting edge and progressive now are out of date. And we have to be willing to continue to expand and evolve our understanding and our vocabulary as we continue to evolve in our understanding and growth and our love of all people. I am aware that it might be uncomfortable at times. Some of the language might feel uncomfortable. One of the words is queer, and I had somebody come up to me at a presentation I was doing, and they were like, "Why are you using that word?" And for many years, it was kind of seen as a derogatory word against LGBTQ people. But it's a word that the community has reclaimed, has worked at reclaiming. And so that is a term that some people might use to describe themselves. There's a lot of other vocabulary that might kind of feel out of the norm for us, but we have to use it. We have to make an earnest effort in our trying to use the vocabulary, especially the way that people describe themselves. It is okay to make a mistake. It's not okay not to try. So we have to try. I'm going to say something here. I don't want it to come across too harsh, but I had somebody kind of become a little bit angry with me in a talk that I was getting, and they said, "It's just hard. It's too hard. I've trained myself to see this person this way or call this person this way." I'm going to say that experiencing bullying and the lasting effects of bullying is hard. Being shot by someone because of the color of your skin is hard. There are a lot of things in life that are difficult. When we put them up against that, calling somebody by their name or the pronoun that they've asked to be called really isn't that hard. So we just have to enter into that space of, I might slip up, I might make a mistake, but I just have to keep doing it. I have to keep going. It's really important work. So, two terms here I think that are really important to clarify, and that's understanding the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. So sexual orientation is an inherent or immutable, enduring emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to another person or other people. Gender identity is one's innermost concept of their self as male or female, or maybe a blend of both, or even neither. It's how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. And one's gender identity very well could be different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. So I think a lot of people maybe get tripped up on those two terms. So kind of in a broad stroke here, when we're talking about sexual orientation, we're talking about maybe who somebody loves, to think about that. When we're talking about gender identity, we're talking about who somebody is, who somebody loves, who somebody is. And understanding those differences is important because we clump them together when we talk about LGBTQ plus people, but they're two very separate and distinctive things. When we're talking about names, perhaps you've heard about pronouns, people using their pronouns. So again, that's who they are, how they're describing themselves. So do I use he, him, his? Do I use she, her, hers? There's kind of been a big debate going on about, can we use the singular they pronoun, they, them, theirs, if somebody doesn't quite see themselves as strictly male or female. So understanding people's pronouns and respecting people's pronouns and how they identify is important. And what you think somebody's pronouns are not necessarily what their pronouns are. So not making assumptions is really important in this work. And talking about the they, them, theirs, one of the important things, this is hard, I think this is even very difficult for me, is breaking the binary, because we've been constructed in a binary world of black and white, male and female, gay or straight. It's difficult for us to break that binary in many aspects of our lives, but it's really important to do that. So I have the genderbread person here to help us. Has anybody seen the genderbread person before? So the genderbread person is really, I think, a great tool to help us understand here. There are 4 things that we've already talked about: gender identity and sexual orientation. But gender identity, as I said before, it's how you think about yourself, who you are. Do you see yourself as a woman or a man, female or male, or are you maybe not quite either? And genderqueer is a term that some people use to describe themselves when they neither see themselves as woman or man. Gender expression is how you portray, how you demonstrate your gender through ways, sometimes how you act, how you dress, how you behave, how you interact with other people. And you've got a spectrum between the feminine and the masculine. Biological sex, we're talking there about kind of, often it's how you get assigned something at birth. They're looking at your sex organs, your hormones, and again, male or female, and then the spectrum in between. And then sexual orientation, again, who you're physically, spiritually, emotionally attracted to. So we have heterosexual, homosexual, and then they kind of given a middle point here, and they're using bisexual. But one of the things that's really important to notice here is that there's a spectrum here. This is what breaking the binary work looks like. It's not just point A, point B, man or woman, feminine or masculine, female or male, heterosexual or homosexual. There's a spectrum, and people identify all across that spectrum. And not only do they identify on a spectrum, but how people identify across their lives is fluid. So somebody may, at some point, really identify more as a woman, and then may come to a different understanding of themselves along a different point of that spectrum. And that's true for all of these things here. They are all on a spectrum, and they're all fluid. And again, I know that in a world that's binary, that's kind of difficult to understand. How could somebody be, switching or, choosing a different thing? It's breaking out of that binary. That's not how we're understanding. We're growing in our understanding of who people are and who they identify. And that's why pronoun work is often very important, because just because we think somebody is here, 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 and here, or whatever it may be, we're then ascribing to them, okay, this is who you are. And that just might not be the case. And we want to respect who people are, how they identify, how they are presenting themselves in that very moment in the world. And this work, the psychological effects of not respecting who people are and where they are can be very detrimental. And that's why we need to make such an earnest effort. And I think all of you are making such an earnest and honest effort at doing this hard work and becoming not just a welcoming, but a truly affirming place, a truly affirming faith community.
Could I ask something?
Sure.
I just saw Bohemian Rhapsody, and so Queen, he really loved that woman. And so where would you say on this chart where?
Well, I think that both the idea of spectrum and fluidity really apply to Freddie Mercury, right? Throughout, now from what we know, he seemed to always identify as a man, but that was, again, in a binary world, so it may not have always been the case. So, I mean, again, gender identity, he always seemed to lean toward identifying himself as a man, but that was a very binary world. Gender expression, however, in many ways, Freddie Mercury could be quite androgynous with his gender expression. And his sexual orientation as well, I think, was along the spectrum, as he had love for both women and men, and for people who may not have even identified as a woman or a man. So I can't, pinpoint exactly, but I think that's a great example of somebody who really applies to the idea of fitting on a spectrum and is fluid across their life of how they identify. Great question. So, all right, the Dear Genderbread Person. I can send this to Larry if anybody wants a copy, and you can take it. It's really helpful, I think, to understanding. All right, let's move into understanding a little bit more about the church and LGBTQ persons. So here, a brief history of the rise of LGBTQ exclusion. Really, the rise of conservative evangelicalism is alongside the founding of the moral majority by figures like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Jim Baker, Jim and Tammy Faye, Tim LaHaye, and Paul Weyrich. And they were really working to tie the church to politics in order to gain wealth and power in the country. And they were, as they were meeting, Paul Weyrich, very interestingly, has since kind of stepped out of the conservative evangelical realm and talked about the fact that they really didn't care about homosexuality, but they knew they were sitting around a table and they knew they had to come up with wedge issues that would drive people to look at how they could, mobilize people so they could gain wealth and power. So there were two main wedge issues that they kind of decided on that period of time. Yes, homosexuality and abortion. Unfortunately, they've had lasting effects. I really don't think that they gave a damn about those two things, but what they created was a society and a culture of people who really do give a damn in a very harming way. So we see a dramatic shift during the late 70s and into the early 80s, a dramatic rightward shift. We then began to really see and experience the extreme push to exclude and harm persons in the church. The moral majority really targeted the evangelical church, and we kind of see a boom of conservative evangelicalism in that point of time. But as it influenced politics and society at large, it spilled over into our mainline denominations as well. I mean, there was really no way that it couldn't. And unfortunately, it continues to be a huge struggle today. That's why we're here tonight, talking about it, and we feel like we have to do it, kind of over and over again, all throughout the church universal. So I want to talk about a few denominational stances today. This is from the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church. Homosexual acts are intrinsically immoral and contrary to natural law, and homosexual tendencies are objectively disordered. Some of you may have grown up Roman Catholic and may have experienced that. I'm going to now talk about my two denominational bodies that I grew up in, the Southern Baptist Church and the United Methodist Church. So here is from the resolution on a Christian response to homosexuality from the Southern Baptist Convention. Even a desire to engage in homosexual relationship is always sinful, impure, degrading, shameful, unnatural, indecent, and perverted. The Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church says the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. We implore families and churches not to reject and condemn our lesbian, gay members and friends. We commit ourselves to be in ministry for and with all persons, which is hard to do when you say that they are incompatible with Christian teaching. That was a very difficult one for me because I felt like I had, in a way, escaped the very difficult environment of the Baptist church that I had grown up in to find a very loving and embracing United Methodist Church began to discern ordained ministry in there, was affirmed by my parish, only to have our district superintendent, who's under the bishop in the UMC, tell me that while he could not deny my call, there was no way that he was going to stick out his neck for me. Again, harm, hurt, happening over and over again. The Episcopal Church, in 1976, both the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops voted for a fully inclusive Episcopal Church, an understanding of what fully inclusive meant at that time. Again, we have to remember what that means. Stating that homosexual persons are children of God who have a full and equal claim with all other persons upon the love, acceptance, and pastoral concern and care of the Church. In 94, sexual orientation was added to the non-discrimination canons for ordination in the Episcopal Church. And then years later, gender identity and expression were also added into the canons. And in 2015, not that long ago, the Episcopal Church finally codified theological support for same-sex marriage. So we have to remember our own history, and while we can be thankful that our denomination certainly is farther along than many others, it's recent history, and there's still a lot of work to do across our denomination of the many different churches that make it up. And of course, St. Simon's has its own history, and y'all know that history much better than I do, but it's really good to recognize and understand what your history is in engaging with, affirming, potentially not welcoming, or welcoming and affirming LGBTQ persons. So, yes.
Is there a denomination that's way forward in recognizing and affirming?
I mean, certainly the Episcopal Church is on the forward side. I mean, I think the United Church of Christ has had generally, the way that their church polity works lends itself to being moving faster. But the United Church of Christ, there's a group of churches that were founded called the Metropolitan Community Churches that were founded in order to be a church for welcoming LGBTQ people back in maybe the late 60s, early 70s, I think somewhere around there. So that has really been their mission and their focus all throughout their denomination. But we're certainly in a good place. We continue to need to be better, but alongside our Presbyterian and ELCA Lutheran, and certainly UCC, brothers, sisters, and siblings, we're doing the work. We're at least doing a lot of the work that needs to be done, but we need to keep at it. We can't slow down. Great question. And of course, it's why I ended up in the Episcopal Church from the United Methodist Church, because I found a home with people who were wonderfully embracing of me. I hope you all know that you have an ally among allies in Pastor Larry Handwork, who is someone that's very important and special in my formation, but who has been doing this work from the time that Jerry Falwell and all of those lovely people were starting to throw their bombs. Larry has been working to create a church and a culture around that church that is embracing and inclusive and affirming. So you're very, very lucky and blessed to have him. Was that right, Larry? Okay. Is that what I'm supposed to say? No. We love Larry. So the way that, of course, many of the more conservative evangelical Christians have arrived at their understanding of how they treat LGBTQ people is around the Bible. And this is kind of what my talk focused on last time, was around these clobber passages. These are the 5 main scripture passages that people typically pull out to talk about why LGBTQ people are sinful and contrary to God's nature and incompatible with Christian teaching and living and those things. So I just want to do a brief kind of review of these things. I am really going to paint with just a roller at this point. We went into more detail last time. I don't have quite the time to be able to go into kind of nitpick detail about all of these, so I'm really going to be making some generalized statements here. But please know that if you are interested in some of the more of the nitty-gritty about these passages, I'm happy to talk with you about those. And you just called Brian as your interim, so you are lucky again to have a person who is going to be able to continue this conversation in a deep and meaningful way with you. So when I found out that he was going to be the interim, I was like, oh my gosh, this church is in great hands. So we have Genesis 1 and 2 talking about the creation story. How many have heard the line before, God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve? Oh, okay, so there's that one. We have in Genesis 19, we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Leviticus 18 and 20, we have what is called the Holiness Code. In Romans 1, we have Paul saying that men lying with men are against nature. And in 1 Corinthians 6, we have certain translations of the Bible saying that LGBTQ people and gay people are excluded from the kingdom, more in particular. So, you know, the Bible is a tricky thing. And we have a complicated relationship with the Bible, and we should have a complicated relationship with the Bible because it's what leads to our understanding of who God is and who we are and how we act as God's people. So let's talk about Sodom and Gomorrah for a second. So a lot of people look at Sodom and Gomorrah and they say, oh, this is a story about men who came to have sex with other men, and then the whole town, the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed then. And that settled it. That is exactly what happened there. But when we take a deeper dive into the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we see that it's really more of a story about hospitality and the social requirements of helping visitors, and really what in Sodom and Gomorrah becomes the lack of hospitality. There are men in the town who decide that they are going to humiliate the visitors by raping them. So it really did not have anything to do with, a sexual attraction toward these men that they were going. No, they were going to do something that was vile in order to humiliate them or to assert their power over them, and that was to rape them. In many cases, that is what rape is about today. It's about asserting power over another person. It's not necessarily about a sexual attraction, sometimes, but not always. It's really disturbing because later on in the story, Lot offers his two daughters who have never been with anybody, and he says, well, why don't you, instead of the visitors, because he's trying to be hospitable to the visitors, why don't you take my two daughters? So that really shows, again, in that period of time, what people thought of women, because instead of he was trying to protect his visitors, and in order to protect his visitors, he was willing to give up his own daughters. But we really end up looking at this as a story of inhospitality and a lack of hospitality, and how to keep power over, or assert power over another person. When you move into the holiness code, and this is in Leviticus where, in Leviticus 18:22, it says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination." And Leviticus 20:13 says, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them." So that's like, those aren't super comforting words for an LGBTQ person to hear, right? But again, what we're talking about here in the holiness code is ritual purity for the Israelites. So there was an understanding that the Israelites needed to distinguish themselves from their pagan neighbors. And so they end up coming up with a list of chapters and chapters upon chapters and chapters of what are often looked at as rules and regulations, rituals that kind of separate them from their neighbors. So their understanding of abomination, we kind of hear that word today and we're like, oh my God. But to them, it just would have meant that it was seen as taboo or potentially unclean. And it would have been seen that way because many things that had to do with sex and sexuality were viewed within like pagan temple rituals and rites and those types of things. And so what they're trying to distinguish here is we don't want to be doing those things that our pagan neighbors are doing, so we're going to create some strict codes here. We see this as well in rules that men are not allowed to, or women are not allowed to have sex when they're menstruating. You're not allowed to eat certain kinds of foods. You're not allowed to mix certain kinds of fabrics. These are all part of the holiness codes, and they're all, again, this distinction with our neighbors. The other thing that's going on here is that the chief purpose of understanding sex and sexuality at this point of time was to build up Israel, to build up the population. The understanding at this point in time is that the new life is coming all from the man, right? It's coming all from the male's seed, and the woman is just a holder, an incubator for this new life that is growing. And so if any sexual act is seen as not going to produce a new life, masturbation included, it's seen as sinful because you are wasting new life away because it's all held within the man there. So we understand that holiness code now in a very different way. We look at these things and say, we're eating shellfish. We all have mixed fabrics on tonight. There was a certain understanding in that context, in that period of time, that led toward that. I'm going to kind of roll through these two. All I want to say about these, and all of these here, the common thread that is woven through them is that there's a thread of wanting to, a thread of power, a wanting to keep power within the hands of a smaller group of people. We see it playing out today. It just changes the faces and the names of the game, but all of these are keeping power in a way. That's what these stories are about. Many of them, if our understanding about LGBTQ persons was vastly different throughout history, we wouldn't be here today, and we'd be talking about something else that was plugged into these stories, that was about people being oppressed or suppressed throughout history because of a way to have a small group keep a certain power over them. The 1 Corinthians passage is interesting because there's not really even a word for homosexuality that appears in the Bible until the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. And so when we move through the King James and to the New King James, to the Revised Standard, to the New Revised Standard, we see a shift in language. And it's really interesting because in Let me make sure I'm getting the translation right here. In the New International Version, for example, it says, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. But what's really interesting is that all the way back in the King James Version, it says, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards. And in the New Revised Standard, which is what we use typically on Sundays, it says, fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God. That language, again, is shifting as understanding about language has shifted throughout the times of those translations, and where people were keeping their thumb on the temperature and kind of understanding, we might have to shift this language around a little bit in order for it to make sense in the context that we're trying to have it make sense with. So it's really important to realize that that is going on as these translations are happening. Yes?
So Dylan, because women have no power, they didn't bother dealing with the lesbians. We're like,
Oh my gosh.
free and they have no power, we get it.
At that point they were like, you know what, we're just, these men who could potentially have power, that's who we're concerned about. Because, women are so off the radar and not having any kind of power whatsoever. You're right, they don't really make an appearance. And of course it is reflected as well by who was authoring these translations, who, again, it's people in power. There was a small group of men, often the culturally dominant men, that were in power. So yes, we tend to see again and again it leaning toward the description of the man. Not always. Romans 1 is a little bit more ambiguous, but for the most part, yes. So we think about biblical authority then. Do we see the Bible as inerrant, as infallible, that there are no errors whatsoever in these, black words that are printed on a white page? They are exactly as God has intended them to be. It's almost as if they were sent down from heaven. That's what I believed in the Baptist church, that somehow, it's almost as if this book dropped down from heaven and God was like, here, this is exactly what I've intended for you to have. So then does it make it infallible, that we can have no other understanding of what has been written? Or do we believe that this book that we have, that we base so much of our existence on as people of faith, is spirit breathed, but still written by people, men mostly, who have an imperfect understanding of God and an imperfect understanding of their faith. So it's really important to make that distinction. Where do you fall in understanding the Bible? Because if you do say, well, I'm a literalist and I believe that it's inerrant, then you confront things in a different way. It might be harder for you to welcome and affirm gay people, but it's also going to be hard for you to welcome and affirm a woman who is a priest. And you've just had an incredible woman who was your priest. It's going to make it difficult to do a lot of work, because there are incredibly concerning passages in the Bible that over and over again exclude many types of people. The Bible was used to justify slavery. The Bible was used to justify Jim Crow. The Bible is used again and again today, in this very week, to justify white supremacy and white privilege. So if you're coming from the Bible and in that lane, being a welcoming and affirming parish is really not a probable thing. But if we look at it with a bunch of different criticisms, understanding what's going on historically, what is going on in that period of time that would be said. Also, what's going on when, redaction criticism, what's going on when the story is being compiled, because a lot of the stories that we read about weren't just, somebody wasn't watching something happen and it's being written down at that period of time, but it's told and told and told again, and then at some point somebody's like, oh, we should probably write this down. But what's happening with that author and in that period of time where it's finally being recorded? What kind of, what are we dealing with in literary criticism? What kind of story is it? Is it a parable? Is it meant to be a hymn or a song of some sort? There are a bunch of different ways that we can look at different passages in the Bible through literary criticism. Again, social science criticism as well. What are the societal norms in that period of time that are understanding? What are the societal norms in this period of time that are causing us to read it in a certain way through the lens that we're reading it in? I can guarantee you that Elizabeth and Larry did not preach from an inerrant literalist perspective of the Bible, and are engaging the Bible in a myriad of ways, those stories that we do hold so sacred, but understand that they're written by somebody who does not have a perfect understanding or vision of God and the world around them. They're in their realm and their realm only when they're writing. Paul is writing his letters and everything with a very small knowledge about a very small group of people. Those letters are often being written to a small house church. Paul thinks that Jesus is coming back in no time. So these letters are not going to be existing for thousands of years because Jesus is coming back any minute. So when you're writing with that understanding, you're writing in an immediate way toward a very small group of people, not meant to apply to the millions and millions and millions of people that are going to be reading this in the Bible as the thousands of years proceed from there. So thinking about the Bible and what kind of authority the Bible has on our understanding is important work. Now, what does affirming mean? Because affirming is very different than tolerating, and it's also very different than welcoming. So when we think about affirming, it's not just welcoming somebody into our midst, because there are a lot of churches that will welcome me that will welcome me as a gay person and happily have me sit in their pews. But if we're talking about affirming me as a child of God, saying that this is who you are created to be, and we want you to be involved in the full life of this place and this community. We celebrate who you are. Well, they're not taking that extra step, right? They've got a very narrow, we'll happily welcome you. We might even happily, set you up with a counselor that will that will welcome you as well. Yes. And give you a pledge card because we'll happily take your money. But there's a real distinction there, and I think that's what y'all are trying to get to. How are we going to be a fully affirming community? Not just when somebody walks in our doors that they're welcome in our midst, but that they are affirmed, that they're celebrated, who they are. When we talk about when we talked about gender identity and talking about who somebody is, when somebody's declared, this is who I am, or with sexual orientation, this is who I love, we're saying that you are a beloved child of God exactly as you are. We affirm that, we celebrate that, and we want you to be part of the full life of this place, not just handing you a pledge card and saying you can sit in our pews. I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey of St. Elizabeth's becoming an affirming community. we've been on this journey, gosh, Larry, for probably about 10 years, really kind of committed to this journey. Daphne Cody became our rector in 2005, and who just left. Certainly, I think, in many ways, a welcoming parish. Was working on becoming a welcoming parish at that period of time. But that rainbow flag would not have been flying there back then, that's for sure, because we had a lot of people who were very concerned about what that would do. What would that mean for us? And so finally, in fact, I think it was when Elizabeth was our priest in charge in 2012, is finally, now when you have an interim or a priest in charge, they can get down and dirty a little bit more than your rector can, because if they piss you off, they're going to be gone in about a year anyway, so it's it's fine. Yeah.
Fair enough.
But Elizabeth made the decision to put that flag out and make a statement that this was a welcoming community, and we were on the journey to becoming an affirming parish. Now, a lot of people worried, is this going to make us a gay church? Are we going to become a gay church? As if somehow when we put this flag out there, we're going to be hordes of gay people like running toward the church, like, oh my God, all of the gay people, all of the LGBTQ people in Glencoe are just, coming out of the woodwork, and here they are flocking. It was great for the music program.
Yeah, I know.
But what and that was a concern that somebody raised, and they were somebody who wanted to be an affirming parish. They're certainly an ally, but raised that concern. What's that going to mean? What we found was that we did have LGBTQ people who walked in our doors, which was of utmost importance, but we had a lot of families, of straight couples who said, this is the kind of place that we want to raise our family in. So our children know that no matter who they are beloved by God. We've had so many visitors to St. E's who have looked on our website or who have been visiting the area and said, this is where we're going to church on Sunday, because that's the kind of place we want to be when we encounter God. And so in many ways, that is what the rainbow flag has done for us. And it's been amazing to see the evolution of some people who were wary in the beginning of what this would mean, who are now people who will put that flag out. And so the conversations that take place, just like this one, and the ones that you've been having, and the ones that you will continue to have, lend themselves to that progress. But what I would say is, put the flag out. Put the flag out. You are in a place where you can put the flag out and say to people, we're continuing on this work. We are always on an ever-evolving journey, but we've got the flag out because we want you to be here, and we need to then continue to learn and grow together. Yes?
Dylan, there may also be people that, I don't know if St. Elizabeth's went through it, where people are concerned like, oh wow, now we're at Target. The right wing is going to pick at us, we're going to be on the news.
Right.
They're going to do something to the church, to the people.
That was definitely a concern. I'm going to keep my eyes on the time here. That was definitely a concern. We have experienced very little of that. I know that First United Methodist Church of Arlington Heights, my dear friends, my dear friend Anna Voinovich was in her candidacy there. My dear friend Liz McEachern-Evans is there. They have been quite bold in their witness in the midst of their denominational struggles as well. I know they've had their flag, I think, ripped and maybe their sign kind of painted on with spray paint before as well. That could happen. But what they have said over at Melissa Early is their senior pastor, what she has said over and over again is, I will go and buy another flag and put it out again and again and again. I will go and get the spray to wipe off that paint again and again and again, because anything that you do to try to block this welcome will not block God's welcome, extravagant welcome of people. So it is a possibility. And it's a possibility that we live with. The only thing that we've had is when we were having an outdoor service on our terrace, which is on the other side, we had somebody drive up when a family was walking up to the service. They were about 5 minutes late to church, so they were walking up to the service, and they pulled over and said, oh, you're one of those disgusting churches. And the mom, who had been a person who 12 years ago said during our search committee for Daphne, we will not call a gay rector, or our family will be gone. So this family is walking up, and she pulled our rector and she pulled me to the side after the service. And the person ended up saying something like, you're not following the word of God and you're on a path to hell and whatever. And she said, I'm so glad that it happened to me and not an LGBTQ person. And I've never felt more proud of the work that our church has done. And I'm all in. So going from somebody who said, if you call a gay rector, we're out, to I'm all in that period of time. I think it's just an incredible what relationships, what conversation, how that transformation can happen. So all of those things, yes, are a possibility, but I think they're worth it. God's love of God's people and proclaiming that is certainly worth it. That's what we're called to do. I know we've got a few minutes left, so I want to get through flying the rainbow flag. One of the important things, the formation of an ongoing LGBTQ group at church. So we have a group that specifically meets to talk about how we are continually growing and understanding, and that we continue learning together. We don't stall out or say, well, we're here, we're flying a rainbow flag, we've got LGBTQ people in the parish, we have people that are coming to church saying, wow, you're doing a good job, your liturgy is progressive and welcome, all of these things. No, that we're as our understanding and society's understanding is evolving, that we are continuing to stay on it. So we continue to watch videos and interviews. We continue to have forums and bring people in. We continue to talk about, this summer we had our very first Pride picnic and celebration. And so we had our own Pride Sunday, and the whole lawn was decked out with gay pride flags and trans, which is, I don't have one on here, but it's like a light blue, a pink, and a white stripe on a flag. We had a bouncy house, and we had all of this stuff. We had people from the community that had never been to St. Elizabeth's before show up. And we had people from other churches come and say, how can we start this work at our church? So that was just an amazing day to see that happening.
Just to say one thing, that the group is not made up of only LGBT. It's across the board.
Yes, yeah. In fact, the head of the group is a straight woman who this has just become a passion of hers. And so yes, the group is made up of all across the spectrum of all of those things that we talked about earlier, of gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation. We have people across the spectrum of all of those identities that make up the group. And it's just an active group that meets about every other month to make sure that we're on it, making sure that our signage and the way that we welcome people is continually moving forward as well, that we don't stall out at any point in time. The other thing that we did is to make a statement of inclusion, because sometimes the words need to be there as well. We can fly a rainbow flag, we can have a progressive liturgy, but sometimes the words are important and they need to be there. So we came up with St. Elizabeth's as a faith community that invites all persons to all levels of participation, leadership, and decision-making within the church, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnicity, age, physical or mental capacity, education, socioeconomic, and marital status. We seek to establish meaningful connections with one another through worship, work, and fellowship as we strive to understand God's purpose for us in the church and in the world. We reached out to people from kind of the different identifying groups here, and said, you know, how should we word this? Is this the direction that we want to go in? And after a lot of work with a bunch of different people, this is where we landed. We've had a lot of people, as we're finally kind of putting this in our bulletin, on our website, and all of those things, talk about the fact that they're so grateful for these words because they can go to somebody and say, this is who we are. This is what our church is about. Now you'll notice we have a lot of different markers here, and this work is intersectional. There's all of these things: race, education, sexuality, ability, age, gender, ethnicity, culture, language, class. They're all part of this work. We are not in a little silo here with just trying to make ourselves more LGBTQ affirming. Because for us to, all of these things overlap in every single one of us. They make us who we are, and they contribute to the very ways that we experience our lives and how we either experience privilege in the world or how we experience oppression and discrimination. There's no way that we can just pick one of these out and say, well, we're going to try to make this better, we're going to try to make this better, or this person experiences life solely because of their class or their age or their gender. No, they're all working together. They all overlap. And so we can't separate them out, and our work needs to be intersectional in our seeking justice and equality for all persons. So if we refuse to engage in a certain area of work, we're going to end up denying our ability to try to, really do work in another area. So we always have to be thinking about, even though, tonight the focus is on LGBTQ, how do we treat people of differing abilities? How are we treating people across the spectrum of age? Are we dismissive of young people? Are we dismissive of older people? When we think about race and ethnicity, are we seeking justice for people? Again, are we coming at this from an area of white privilege? And if we're excluding people of different races and ethnicities in our work, well, we're not going to be very successful in our work here. Violence is highest in the LGBT community against transgender Black women, and that is not a coincidence. It's intersectional. Okay, so the work that we do spans across these things in trying to overcome and seek justice. We've got maybe 2 slides left. So as we're continuing to learn and grow at St. E's, and things that you will probably be considering here, one of them is how we introduce ourselves. And this is going back to pronoun work. We are in the process of getting name tags that don't only say my name is, but also say my pronouns are. So it goes back again to that, not making an assumption about somebody and how they identify. So instead of somebody walking into a place and being afraid that they're going to be surrounded by people who aren't going to respect who they are, or they're going to feel awkward about having to introduce themselves and who they are. A lot of people that we talked to said this kind of takes that part out of it. It takes that mystery, it takes that anxiety away from it. And when that's there, you shouldn't get it wrong. When somebody says my name is, and this is what my pronouns are, you respect them by identifying them that way. And so we're kind of in the process of working on that. And our bathroom signage, we have a lot of single stall restrooms. There are even places that have more than, double or triple stall that have made them all gender restrooms that just have stalls in them. And they say, you go to many places, especially in Europe, and there's just a stall there, and it doesn't matter how you identify, you're closing the door and going to the bathroom. But at St. E's, as kind of a first step, all of our single stall restrooms are getting this signage that it's a safe place for anybody who identifies across the gender spectrum to walk into that bathroom and not feel like they're going to have to be shamed or embarrassed or explain themselves when they walk out of that door in any way. So here's the importance of this work. I'm me being here with you tonight because this little boy that grew up in a fundamentalist Baptist tradition with his grandpa being the head elder of the church and going to church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, moves to a place where most of my family has grown to be very accepting and supportive and even affirming of me. Not all, most. I have walked into the doors of a church that fully embraces, celebrates, and affirms who I am, and fully affirms and celebrates my call on my life from God to be clergy. So I get to walk into a church with incredibly loving people who are encouraging me along my journey, who are celebrating the way that God has created me and my fiance, pushing me to be hopefully a well-rounded pastor one day. Walking into the doors of a place that flies that flag after my background, which is difficult coming out and dealing with, family issues and all of that kind of stuff, is an unexplainable feeling. It's wonderful to have that affirmation there. Any more questions, comments to close out? Yes.
What kind of growing pains did St. E go through as they tried to move towards becoming an affirming community?
So like I said, we had people voicing their concern over whether we were going to, become a gay church, a church that's just solely filled with gay people. We had, there were not that many people who packed up and left. We had a few people who visited St. E's that said, this is too open. It's not quite the place for us. Well, we can only be so many things to so many different people. As much as, we talk about drawing a wide circle, that wide circle probably isn't going to include people who believe that gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender and queer people are going to hell and that they're an abomination and all those things. That's just not where we live as a community. So somebody who feels that way, who sees the Bible as inerrant and infallible and believes that we operate from that inerrancy and infallibility, is just probably not going to make their home with us. They're welcome, but we're not going to be affirming those beliefs. So we certainly had people who stuck around, who wish that we weren't doing that work, but they didn't really decrease their pledge. They didn't necessarily start coming any less. And to be honest, a lot of them, as I said, went through transformation during that period of time. We talked about the woman who said, again, we'll leave if we call a gay rector, to I'm all the way in. She came up to me the Sunday after Daphne announced that she would be leaving, and she said, can we just call you? That's a lot of where I celebrate the work that she has done as well, to open herself up through that period of time. But that's where we've gone. I mean, again, trying new things out, as well as things in our liturgy. I mean, you guys, I think, are doing it here. Larry probably knows better than me, but you know, having liturgy that's not just coming from the Book of Common Prayer and songs coming from the hymnal that have very gendered language, obviously language that's coming from the 1970s, where our understandings about things are very different, using different expressions of liturgies and prayers and songs that are more welcoming to people all across the spectrum, who are coming to be with us at St. E's. Sometimes those things don't always work, right? And you kind of have to deal with the repercussions of something, and that may just be somebody saying, I don't like that very much. But you have to be willing to put yourself out there to try. Can you think of anything else, Larry?
One of the things that struck me from Colby Martin's book on Unclobbered is that he talks about, we have to remember the long journey most gay and lesbian people and transgender people take to get to owning who they are. And straight folk have to go through the same thing in accepting this whole spectrum.
Yeah. And that's the work, again, that was done over that period of time. It's going back to what I said in the beginning. There are going to be times potentially of discomfort in the way that maybe people are identifying themselves, the language that they use to describe who they are, and you may get it wrong. But my hope is always, and I always try to operate from a place of, if I know that somebody is trying, I'm happy to have the conversation, or to say, oh, you know what, I heard you say this. I don't think you meant that at all. I think you're coming from a good place, versus somebody who just doesn't give a damn, and they're not trying, and they don't care, and they don't want to. And that's a different place, because that says, I'm not willing to fully embrace who you are and affirm, and I'm not willing to work it myself. So we had very, very little of that at St. E's. We have people who get it wrong all the time. We have people who don't always use the right words, the right vocabulary, but they're people who are trying. And I think, from what I hear and what I gather, that most of you here are there and are doing that as well, or moving at least toward that. That if somebody walks in your doors as a guest, that they will feel not only welcomed, but affirmed and celebrated in who they are, and that this could be a community for them exactly as God has created them to be. Yes. Anything else? You are left in good hands, in wonderful hands. So thank you so much for having me tonight.